The men who look most confident with women are rarely the ones who were born that way. They are usually the ones who were broken first. I know because confidence like that doesn't come from comfort. It comes from damage that was studied, not ignored. From moments where believing too much cost everything. From realizing that hope by itself is not a strategy. What you see as ease is often restraint. What looks like charm is often control. And what feels like emotional intelligence is usually scar tissue that learned how to function. The smooth man in the room didn't wake up one day understanding women. He learned the hard way what not understanding them does to you. He paid for clarity with pain, repetition, and loss. And instead of collapsing under it, he adapted. This story is not about manipulation. It's about transformation. About how disappointment educates faster than optimism ever could. Before we go deeper, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. If this kind of psychological storytelling resonates with you, consider subscribing. Quietly, no pressure. I remember the first time I noticed him. He didn't announce himself. He didn't rush. He didn't scan the room like someone hunting for approval. He simply entered as if the space had already accepted him before he arrived. A fitted jacket, groomed but not excessive. His posture relaxed to shoulders, loose movements, economical. Nothing about him was loud, yet everything about him was noticed. Within minutes, the atmosphere around him shifted. The barista smiled longer than necessary. A woman at the next table leaned in without realizing she had moved. Another laughed at something that wasn't particularly funny, then seemed surprised at herself for doing so. It all happened quietly, efficiently, as if governed by rules I had never been taught. I watched from a distance, pretending not to. What struck me wasn't envy. It was confusion. He wasn't saying anything remarkable. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress. He spoke slowly, listened without leaning forward, smiled without asking for anything in return. The interaction flowed as if gravity itself was helping him. 10 minutes later, he walked out with 2 phone numbers and 3 women subtly recalibrating their emotional boundaries, unsure when they had given ground. I sat there longer than I needed to, replaying what I had just seen. How did he know when to speak and when to stop? How did he sense interest before it was declared? How did he move through complexity without hesitation while I still second-guessed eye contact? The story I told myself was the same one most men tell themselves in moments like that. He's just built differently. He was born with something I don't have. He understands women naturally. That belief is comforting because it removes responsibility. If attraction is genetic, then failure isn't personal. It's destiny. Some men are chosen, others are not. Dating culture reinforces this myth relentlessly. We label men like him as naturals, alphas, charismatic types. We talk about game as if it were a gene, not a skill. We assume that confidence appears fully formed rather than constructed. But that explanation never sat right with me. Because I had known men like him before they became this version of themselves. I'd seen them hesitate, overinvest, fall apart over women who barely noticed them. I had watched them try to love correctly and fail spectacularly, which meant the story of effortless talent didn't hold up. The truth is less flattering, but far more useful. What looks like natural ability is almost always unconscious competence. Skill practiced so thoroughly that effort disappears from the surface. The same way a surgeon's hands don't shake, not because surgery is easy, but because they've learned where shaking leads. Think about a concert pianist. When you watch them perform, it feels intimate, fluid, emotional. Their fingers move as if the music is simply passing through them. You don't see strain. don't see calculation. You don't see the thousands of wrong notes, the cramped hands, the hours spent repeating the same measure until frustration turned into muscle memory. You only see the result. Romantic skill works the same way. The man who moves smoothly with women is not free from effort. He has simply paid the cost in advance. He has already made the mistakes you're still afraid of making, already misread signals, already said the wrong thing, already trusted too quickly, already stayed too long. That ease is not innocence. It's compression. Every pause in his speech carries information learned from conversations that went badly. Every calibrated smile is the residue of smiles that weren't returned. Every moment of emotional restraint is built on memories of what happened when restraint was absent. But here's the part no one wants to admit. Most of these men didn't pursue mastery because they wanted power. They pursued it because staying the same hurt too much. Remaining romantically incompetent isn't neutral. It has consequences: confusion, self-doubt, rejection that feels personal even when it isn't. Watching women choose men who appear to care less while you're giving everything you have. At some point, that pain forces a decision. You either retreat into resentment, telling yourself women are shallow or broken, or you start paying attention. The men who choose the second path don't announce it. They don't rebrand themselves overnight. They begin quietly, almost clinically observing what actually happens instead of what they were told should happen. They notice that intensity repels more often than it attracts, that availability lowers perceived value, that approval seeking changes the emotional balance of an interaction. They start connecting dots they were never encouraged to see. And slowly, something shifts. Their interactions stop being about outcome and start being about calibration. Not how do I get her to like me, but what is actually happening here. Not what should I say, but what is being responded to. This is where the illusion is born. From the outside, it looks like confidence appeared spontaneously, as if one day they woke up immune to nerves untouched by self-doubt. But internally, it's the opposite. They are hyper-aware. They've just learned where awareness matters and where it doesn't. They don't rush because rushing once cost them something important. They don't over-explain because they remember how that sounded. They don't chase because they remember how that ended. The smoothness you see is not ease. It's economy. And economy only comes from scarcity. From learning that attention, emotion, and investment are resources that must be managed, not given away reflexively. The greatest illusion in modern dating culture is that some men never struggled. In reality, the men who appear most at ease with women are often the ones who struggled the longest. They just stopped advertising it. They stopped talking about the learning curve because the learning curve was humiliating. Because admitting how lost they once were threatens the myth of effortlessness that now works in their favor. You're not witnessing magic. You're witnessing adaptation. And adaptation always leaves marks. There is a phase no one talks about. Not because it's rare, but because it's humiliating. Before a man becomes composed with women, he is usually awkward in ways he would rather forget. He misjudges timing. He confuses politeness with interest. He mistakes intensity for sincerity. And every mistake feels like a referendum on his worth. I know this phase well because I lived in it longer than I care to admit. Back then, I believed that effort should be visible, that showing interest clearly was a form of honesty, that consistency would be interpreted as strength. I thought attraction worked like a ledger. Put enough good behavior in and something meaningful would come out. It didn't. What came out instead were polite rejections, slow fades, Sudden disappearances that arrived without explanation. Women who seemed engaged one week and distant the next. Conversations that felt promising in my head and flat in reality. At first, I blamed luck, then timing, then women themselves. But the pattern didn't change. And when patterns persist, denial becomes expensive. This is where most men stop looking. They retreat into stories that protect the ego. They tell themselves women don't know what they want, or that modern dating is broken, or that there's simply not that guy. Those stories are comfortable. They require nothing. I chose something else. Not because I was disciplined, but because I was tired. Tired of guessing. Tired of hoping. Tired of being surprised by outcomes I should have seen coming. So I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Not emotionally, analytically. I replayed conversations without defending myself in them. I looked at moments where interest shifted and asked what changed just before it did. I compared what I said to how it landed, not how I intended it to land. This is when I realized something uncomfortable. The men who looked natural weren't improvising. They were executing patterns they no longer had to think about. Their ease wasn't innocence, it was repetition. Just like a surgeon who no longer hesitates before an incision, they weren't confident because the situation was safe. They were confident because they had survived worse. Every smooth interaction was built on a graveyard of failed ones. And unlike movies or advice columns, no one congratulates you for those failures. There is no applause for being ignored, no ceremony for being replaced, no acknowledgement for the nights spent questioning your perception of reality. You either learn or you repeat. What I began to understand was that romantic competence is not learned through success. It is learned through controlled exposure to failure. You don't learn what signals mean by getting everything right. You learn by misreading them and suffering the consequences. You don't understand pacing by being rewarded for eagerness. You understand it by watching eagerness push people away. This kind of education is slow and private. There are no teachers, only feedback. And feedback in dating is brutal because it's indirect. People rarely tell you why they lost interest. They simply stop offering it, which forces you to reverse engineer reality without a manual. This is where effort becomes invisible. At some point, patterns start to compress. You no longer think in sentences. You think in dynamics. You sense when to pull back, not because you're afraid, but because you recognize the rhythm breaking. You pause not because you're nervous, but because continuing would lower the temperature. From the outside, this looks like intuition. It isn't. It's memory that no longer needs words. But there's another truth that matters even more. Most men don't choose to become skilled. They are cornered into it. Remaining emotionally naive is not neutral. It extracts a toll. Every misstep costs confidence. Every rejection compounds self-doubt. And eventually, the price of staying uneducated becomes higher than the price of learning. That's when the shift happens. Not toward manipulation, toward accuracy. I stopped asking myself how I felt in the moment and started asking what was happening in the moment. I stopped assuming sincerity created attraction and started observing what actually sustained it. What emerged wasn't cynicism, it was clarity. I noticed that conversations flowed better when I wasn't trying to impress. That interest grew when I didn't rush to secure it. That humor landed when it wasn't used as a tool. That silence was not the enemy I had been taught to fear. These realizations weren't empowering at first. They were destabilizing because they contradicted everything I thought made me a good man. I had been operating under moral logic, in a psychological system. I thought being correct was enough. I thought intention mattered more than impact. It doesn't. Attraction doesn't respond to virtue. It responds to balance. Once that became clear, everything else reorganized around it. I stopped narrating myself. I stopped explaining my interest. I stopped trying to be chosen, not because I became indifferent, but because I became precise. And precision is what most people mistake for confidence. The reason skilled men don't talk about this phase is not arrogance. It's survival. Admitting how disoriented you once were threatens the image that now protects you. It invites questions you don't want to answer. It collapses the illusion that makes interactions smoother. So the illusion remains intact. Men who struggle assume others never did. Men who learned stay silent about the cost. But the cost is the point. There is no shortcut past the awkward stage. No bypass around miscalibration. No way to acquire social fluency without being socially clumsy first. The men who look effortless have simply failed enough times that effort is no longer visible. They didn't transcend insecurity. They mapped it. And once insecurity is mapped, it stops controlling you. It becomes data. The pattern becomes clearer once you stop looking at the man he is and start looking at the man he was. Almost without exception, the men who later move through romantic spaces with calm precision begin their journey on the opposite end of the spectrum. They don't start as strategists. They start as believers. I was one of them. I believed in love the way it was taught, fully, earnestly, without irony. I believed that sincerity was rare and therefore valuable, that devotion would be recognized, that consistency would create safety, and safety would create desire. I didn't approach women as puzzles to solve. I approached them as promises to keep. I listened carefully. I remembered details. I made space for their feelings. I showed up when I said I would. I invested early because I thought clarity was kindness. I offered reassurance freely because I assumed reassurance built trust. From the outside, this looked admirable. From the inside, it felt right. This is what people mean when they talk about the good guy. Not weak, not deceptive, just emotionally available in a world that quietly punishes availability when it arrives without restraint. At first, I interpreted every small success as confirmation that I was doing it correctly. A long conversation, a deep confession, a late-night text. These felt like progress, like momentum. Then came the confusion. Women I adored would drift. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just enough to make me question my footing. Responses slowed. Energy changed. Interest softened without explanation. And eventually they would choose someone else. Someone less invested, someone less available. Someone who seemed by every moral metric I understood less deserving. I told myself it was coincidence, that timing was wrong, that I simply hadn't found the right person yet. But the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. The more I invested, the less secure the connection became. The more I tried to create certainty, the more uncertainty appeared. The women I treated with the most care seemed to slip through my fingers the fastest. This is where the romantic refugee is born, not in bitterness, in disorientation. Because when effort produces the opposite of its intended result, the mind enters conflict. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. I experienced it as a quiet panic. If love works the way I was taught, why does it keep failing me? If my intentions are pure, why do my outcomes feel humiliating? If I'm doing everything right, why does it keep ending the same way? Most people cannot sit inside that question for long. It threatens identity. It suggests that something foundational is wrong, not with others, but with the framework you're using to understand reality. So many men escape at this point. They retreat into resentment, convincing themselves women are irrational, shallow, or broken. That story restores the ego quickly, but it costs you accuracy. I couldn't afford that cost anymore. There was a moment, often quiet, sometimes brutal, where idealism collapses under evidence. For me, it wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was repetition. The same ending over and over, until denial required more energy than acceptance. I began to see myself clearly for the first time. Not as virtuous, as predictable. I realized that my behavior followed a script I had never questioned. A script that rewarded me with moral superiority, but punished me with romantic invisibility. I was offering emotional certainty in situations where uncertainty created tension. I was signaling availability before value had been established. I was trying to secure outcomes before attraction had stabilized. None of this made me bad, but it made me ineffective. The romantic refugee emerges the moment a man accepts that being good is not the same as being desired. That love is not awarded for effort. That attraction does not operate as a reward system for correct behavior. This realization is devastating because it demands a sacrifice. You have to let go of the story where you were right and unlucky. You have to accept that your sincerity, while genuine, may have been misplaced. That the very traits you took pride in may have been interpreted in ways you never intended. I didn't become cold overnight. I became cautious. I stopped assuming that depth should be offered immediately. I stopped volunteering my emotional position before it was asked for. I began to notice how often my honesty was actually an attempt to control uncertainty. This is where many men misunderstand the transformation. They think the romantic refugee becomes manipulative, detached, cruel. That's not what happens. What happens is withdrawal from fantasy. The fantasy that love is simple. The fantasy that effort guarantees outcome. The fantasy that attraction follows moral logic. When those illusions break, something harder but more reliable takes their place. Realism. The romantic refugee doesn't stop caring. He stops overextending. He stops assuming. He stops confusing emotional intensity with connection. And this shift doesn't come from reading books or watching videos. It comes from loss that is personal enough to demand change. There is often a final relationship that acts as a catalyst, the one that ends in a way that leaves no room for rationalization. The woman who chooses someone else while telling you that you did nothing wrong. The moment you hear "you're too nice" spoken without malice, but with finality. That sentence changes you, because it reframes everything you thought was an asset into a liability. And once that happens, you cannot return to innocence. You can only rebuild. The romantic refugee does not rebuild with optimism. He rebuilds with observation, with boundaries, with a quiet resolve to never again hand over his emotional center before understanding the terrain he's standing on. From the outside, this looks like confidence forming. From the inside, it feels like retreating behind a line you didn't know you needed. This is the origin story no one celebrates. The place where belief gives way to strategy. Where hope is replaced not by despair, but by discipline. And once you cross that threshold, there is no going back. Because you've seen what blind faith costs. Every transformation has a point of no return. For the romantic refugee, it isn't gradual. It's sharp, personal, and unmistakable. There's always a moment that ends the old belief system completely. Not weakens it, ends it. I didn't know it at the time, but I was approaching mine. Up until then, I had still been negotiating with reality, making small adjustments, pulling back slightly, then leaning in again, trying to preserve the core of who I was while hoping outcomes would change. They didn't. The final betrayal rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There are no villains, no raised voices, no public collapse. What makes it final is not how loud it is, but how cleanly it severs illusion from truth. In my case, it was a relationship where I did everything I believed in. I showed up, I listened, I committed early and without ambiguity. And in return, I was assured that I was valued, that my consistency was appreciated, that my presence mattered, until it didn't. The ending arrived calmly, almost politely. I was told I was safe, reliable, good. And then I was replaced by someone who embodied none of those traits. That was the moment something went silent inside me. Not anger, not hatred, certainty. Certainty that what I had been taught about attraction was not just incomplete. It was actively misleading. This is the moment psychologists would call a cognitive rupture, the point where the mind can no longer reconcile belief with evidence, where self-protection demands reorganization. I remember walking home afterward, replaying conversations with a clarity I had never allowed before. I noticed how often reassurance had flowed in one direction, how frequently I had adjusted myself to maintain harmony, how little resistance there had been to my availability. I wasn't betrayed because I was unworthy. I was betrayed because I was predictable. That realization is brutal because it removes the comfort of victimhood. It forces responsibility without offering consolation. The final betrayal teaches a lesson that no advice ever can. Being chosen is not the same as being respected. Being liked is not the same as being desired. Being good is not the same as being effective. Once that lesson lands, it reorganizes everything. I stopped asking what women wanted me to be and started asking what women responded to. I stopped measuring my behavior against ideals and started measuring it against outcomes. This is where emotion gives way to curiosity. Not bitterness, not resentment, curiosity. Why did pulling back slightly increase interest? Why did slowing down deepen engagement? Why did certainty kill tension? I treated my own heartbreak like data. Cold, unforgiving, useful. I replayed the entire relationship not to mourn it, but to audit it. I examined every moment where I had assumed emotional safety was the goal. Every time I had offered reassurance instead of allowing uncertainty to breathe. What I discovered was not that women were manipulative or deceptive. It was that attraction operates on tension, not comfort. And tension cannot exist where outcomes are guaranteed. The final betrayal doesn't make a man cruel. It makes him precise. After that point, I no longer approached women as emotional destinations. I approached them as environments to be understood. I stopped volunteering vulnerability before there was evidence it would be received responsibly. This was not a conscious strategy at first. It was instinctive withdrawal, the psyche protecting itself from repeating the same injury. And something unexpected happened. The less I tried to secure connection, the more connection appeared. The less I explained myself, the more interest grew. The more I allowed space, the more women leaned in. At first, this disturbed me. It contradicted everything I wanted to believe about love. But denial had already failed me. I wasn't willing to let ideology hurt me again. This is the beginning of the laboratory phase. The period where the romantic refugee stops living emotionally and starts observing psychologically. I no longer entered interactions hoping for validation. I entered them to watch what happened, to test pacing, to notice reactions, to see how different levels of investment altered dynamics. My heart became a controlled environment. Not because I didn't feel, but because feeling without understanding had proven dangerous. I learned that attraction responds more strongly to curiosity than devotion. That women became more animated when I didn't try to lock down meaning. That desire grew when outcomes remained uncertain. These were not theories. They were repeated observations. And repetition creates conviction. The final betrayal strips you of innocence, but it gives you something more durable in return. Discernment. You stop assuming sincerity is rare. You stop romanticizing struggle. You stop equating pain with depth. You begin to see relationships as systems governed by psychological rules, not moral rewards. This shift feels cold at first, like you've lost something essential. But what you've actually lost is naivety. The romantic refugee does not become heartless. He becomes selective. He learns that access to his emotional world must be earned, not granted automatically. From the outside, this looks like emotional maturity. From the inside, it feels like survival. Once you have been betrayed at that level, you don't need motivation to change. The pain itself enforces the lesson. You don't need encouragement to observe. You can't afford not to. And once you've crossed that line, there is no returning to who you were. Because who you were believed without verification. Who you become demands evidence. After the final betrayal, emotion no longer leads. Curiosity does. Not the curious excitement of discovery, but the cold curiosity of someone who has learned that assumptions are expensive. This is the phase where the romantic refugee stops participating in his own feelings and starts observing them from a distance. I didn't announce this shift. No one does. It happens quietly in the way you speak less and watch more. In the way you stop trying to be understood and start trying to understand. I entered what I later recognized as a laboratory phase. Not because I wanted power, but because ignorance had become dangerous. In this phase, every interaction becomes data. Not in a mechanical way, but in a disciplined one. I wasn't trying to win conversations anymore. I was trying to see them clearly. I noticed how quickly attraction faded when I moved to secure it. How interest softened the moment I framed connection as certainty. How women leaned back when I leaned in emotionally and leaned in when I gave space. These patterns were not subtle once I stopped protecting my ego. I realized how often I'd mistaken emotional transparency for strength. How frequently my honesty was actually an attempt to reduce my own anxiety. I had been offering clarity not because it was needed, but because uncertainty made me uncomfortable. The laboratory phase forces a brutal correction. You stop asking what feels right and start asking what works. Not what works morally, what works psychologically. I tested small changes, slower pacing, less explanation, more silence. I allowed conversations to end without resolution. I stopped filling gaps with reassurance. I let women wonder where they stood instead of rushing to define it. What shocked me was not that these adjustments changed outcomes. It was how reliably they did. Interest increased when I was less available. Respect appeared when I stopped overgiving. Desire surfaced when I allowed tension to exist instead of dissolving it with comfort. This didn't make me proud. It made me sober, because it forced me to confront a truth I had avoided. Attraction is not a response to virtue. It is a response to emotional polarity. The laboratory phase also revealed how much of dating advice is designed to protect feelings rather than explain reality. People prefer narratives that preserve dignity over frameworks that produce results. But pain had removed my need for comfort. I wanted accuracy. So I began studying behavior instead of words, timing instead of intention, reaction instead of explanation. I watched how women responded differently to the same man depending on his emotional posture. How tone mattered more than content, how presence outweighed performance. I noticed that men who were obsessed with being liked were rarely respected. That those who were comfortable being misunderstood carried more gravity. That emotional restraint read as confidence, even when it was simply discipline. The laboratory phase creates emotional detachment, but not numbness. It creates distance from outcome, not disinterest. I still felt attraction. I still enjoyed connection, but I no longer needed any single interaction to confirm my worth. This shift alone changed everything. When you are no longer trying to extract validation, your attention becomes lighter. When you are not invested in approval, your reactions slow down. When you are not afraid of losing someone, you behave differently without trying to. Women sense this immediately. Not because I projected dominance, but because I removed neediness. Neediness is not about wanting. It is about requiring. The laboratory phase teaches you the difference. I also began to see patterns in female behavior that had been invisible when I was emotionally involved. I recognized testing behaviors for what they were. I saw how women evaluated boundaries before investing, how interest often appeared indirectly through attention rather than declarations. This awareness did not come from suspicion. It came from repetition. Men who remain emotionally naive assume that confusion is mysterious. Men in the laboratory phase understand that confusion is informative. Every mixed signal pointed to misalignment. Every sudden shift revealed imbalance. Every moment of distance communicated something I had previously ignored. Instead of reacting, I observed. Instead of correcting, I adjusted. Instead of chasing, I waited. The laboratory phase is where the romantic refugee begins to look confident. Not because he feels powerful, but because he is no longer reactive. He does not rush to fix emotional discomfort. He allows it to exist and watches what it does to the dynamic. He does not interpret silence as rejection. He interprets it as information. This phase also exposes an uncomfortable reality. Most people do not want to be understood as much as they want to be felt. And being felt requires space. I learned that attraction deepens in the absence of constant reassurance. That curiosity grows when answers are delayed. That emotional pacing matters more than emotional availability. These lessons are not gentle. They dismantle the romantic narratives you were taught to value. They challenge the belief that openness always builds intimacy. They force you to accept that desire and safety do not emerge simultaneously. The laboratory phase doesn't make you manipulative. It makes you observant. It doesn't teach you to play games. It teaches you to stop playing the wrong ones. I became more selective about where I invested emotion, not because I was afraid of pain, but because I understood its cost. I learned to recognize women who responded to depth versus those who responded to attention. Those who wanted connection versus those who wanted validation. This discernment felt like growing up quickly, not in years, in awareness. By the end of this phase, something fundamental had changed. I no longer believed what people said about attraction. I believed what consistently happened. And that belief, grounded in observation rather than hope, created a kind of calm that others mistook for natural confidence. It wasn't. It was learned restraint, and once learned, it's hard to unlearn. What most people call confidence is often just scar tissue doing its job. By the time the laboratory phase settles into habit, something structural has changed, not on the surface, but underneath. The romantic refugee no longer approaches women from an exposed psychological center. There is now a boundary, quiet, firm, non-negotiable. This boundary is not bitterness, it is memory. Psychological scar tissue forms the same way physical scar tissue does. When skin is torn deeply enough, the body doesn't replace it with something equally soft. It replaces it with something stronger, less sensitive, more resistant, designed not for beauty, but for survival. The same mechanism applies here. The belief system that once guided me, idealistic, generous, open, didn't disappear. It was overwritten, replaced by a framework built to prevent the same injury from happening again. I stopped assuming permanence. I stopped expecting reciprocity. I stopped building futures in my head before the present had stabilized. From the outside, this looked like emotional control. From the inside, it felt like reinforcement. This is where many observers misread the transformation. They assume the man has become detached, arrogant, or emotionally unavailable. In reality, he has simply learned where not to place his weight. He still feels, but he no longer leads with feeling. This shift creates what I call defensive mastery, a skill set developed not to dominate, but to avoid collapse. Defensive mastery is born from necessity. It forms when the cost of misreading signals becomes too high, when one more emotional miscalculation feels intolerable. I learned to read women not because I wanted leverage, but because misunderstanding had hurt me before. I learned conversational pacing not to impress, but to prevent dynamics from spiraling out of balance. I learned restraint not to appear powerful, but because unrestrained emotion had proven dangerous. This is why defensive mastery often surpasses natural talent. A man who has never been deeply hurt can afford to be careless. A man who has been devastated cannot. The urgency is different. Imagine two people learning to swim. One learns in a warm pool with instructors and encouragement. The other learns after being thrown into open water, gasping, panicking, realizing that failure has immediate consequences. The second swimmer learns faster, not because he is gifted, but because the stakes are real. Defensive mastery operates the same way. Every boundary is reinforced by memory. Every pause is informed by experience. Every moment of restraint is anchored in a lesson already paid for. This is where the appearance of confidence becomes misleading. People assume confidence means comfort, ease, lack of fear. In reality, this kind of confidence is built on accurate fear, fear that has been studied, mapped, and contained. I was no longer afraid of rejection. I was afraid of misalignment. No longer afraid of being alone. Afraid of repeating patterns I now understood. So my behavior changed. I stopped over-investing early. I stopped explaining my intentions. I stopped offering emotional certainty to people who had not demonstrated stability. This did not make me cold. It made me selective. And selectivity reads as value. Women sensed the boundary immediately, not consciously, viscerally. They felt that access to me required calibration, that my attention was not guaranteed, that my approval was not automatic. This wasn't posturing, it was genuine, because I no longer needed them to like me to feel intact. That independence is what people respond to. Not because it's rare, but because it signals self-containment. It communicates that I am not outsourcing my emotional regulation to the room. The scar tissue also dulled certain sensitivities. I no longer reacted strongly to fluctuations in interest. A delayed reply did not trigger anxiety. A shift in tone did not collapse my mood. I registered these changes, but they didn't control me. This emotional insulation is often mistaken for indifference. It isn't. It's prioritization. The romantic refugee has learned that not every emotional signal deserves a response, that not every opportunity requires pursuit, that not every connection merits investment. And this restraint creates space for women to move toward him rather than feeling managed, space for desire to develop without being suffocated by reassurance, space for attraction to exist without being immediately claimed. Ironically, the very protections designed to prevent pain also make him more appealing. Not because he is withholding affection, but because he is no longer leaking need. Need is loud, scar tissue is quiet, and quiet carries weight. There is also a depth that forms here that people rarely articulate. The romantic refugee has lived through emotional extremes. He knows what heartbreak feels like from the inside. He understands loss, betrayal, and disappointment not as concepts, but as states of being. That experience adds gravity. When he listens, he isn't performing empathy. He recognizes emotional terrain because he's walked through it himself. When he speaks, his words carry less optimism, but more accuracy. Women feel this. They sense that he is not guessing, that his calm is not ignorance, that his restraint is not insecurity. This depth paired with boundaries creates a paradox. He feels both safe and unpredictable, present but not grasping, engaged but not dependent. It is an attractive combination because it offers connection without burden. But there is a cost. Scar tissue is less sensitive than skin. The same protection that prevents devastation also dulls certain sensations. The romantic refugee feels less easily, but more deliberately. Joy is quieter. Attachment is slower. Trust is conditional. This is not tragedy. It is trade-off. And at this stage, most men accept it willingly, because the alternative emotional exposure without understanding no longer feels noble. It feels reckless. The confidence you see now is not belief in a positive outcome. It is belief in one's ability to handle a negative one. That is the difference. And that difference changes everything. Once scar tissue forms, perception changes. Not emotionally, structurally. This is where the romantic refugee develops what I call emotional archaeology. The ability to read beneath the surface of interaction, to excavate meaning instead of accepting presentation. Before this phase, I listened to words. I trusted tone. I took behavior at face value. I believed what was offered because I wanted to believe it. After enough damage, that stops, not because trust disappears, but because trust becomes conditional on consistency. Emotional archaeology is not suspicion. It is pattern recognition refined by consequence. I began noticing gaps. The distance between what was said and what was done. The difference between enthusiasm in private and restraint in public. The subtle shifts in energy that preceded withdrawal. These things had always been there. I just hadn't known how to read them. Pain taught me. I replayed old conversations and saw them differently. Compliments that had replaced interest. Affection that appeared only when attention was threatened. Intimacy that peaked just before distance followed. This wasn't paranoia. It was clarity. Men who haven't been hurt assume confusion is random. Men who have been hurt enough understand that confusion is patterned. The archaeological skill develops because it has to. If you keep misreading signals, you keep getting blindsided, and eventually, the psyche demands better tools. I learned to distinguish politeness from desire, validation seeking from connection seeking, emotional availability from emotional curiosity. This changed how I responded. I no longer chased enthusiasm that wasn't followed by action. I no longer invested in warmth that appeared inconsistently. I stopped rewarding attention that had no intention behind it. Women noticed, not because I confronted them, but because my behavior stopped compensating for ambiguity. Ambiguity survives on participation. When one side stops filling gaps, uncertainty reveals itself. This is where strategic indifference emerges. It's a phrase that sounds cruel until you understand it. Strategic indifference is not apathy. It is calibrated care. Caring enough to engage, not caring enough to need. This balance is almost impossible to achieve without having first cared too much. I learned it by overinvesting until it hurt, by watching how excessive interest collapsed attraction, by feeling the internal panic that comes from needing an outcome to validate you. Strategic indifference is the antidote to that panic. It is the ability to enjoy interaction without attaching identity to outcome, to pursue without chasing, to express interest without demanding reassurance. This does not happen through discipline alone. It happens through memory. Memory of what neediness feels like. Memory of what it costs. Memory of how visible it is. Once you've felt the humiliation of overexposure, you don't need reminders. Your nervous system enforces restraint automatically. Women respond to this immediately. Not because they admire indifference, but because they relax around it. There is no pressure to perform, no demand to reciprocate emotion prematurely, no subtle plea for validation. They feel free, and freedom is attractive. The paradox is simple. The less a man needs approval, the more approval he receives. The less he chases certainty, the more certainty emerges. This is not philosophy. It is observable behavior. Strategic indifference also teaches discrimination. I learned to tell the difference between women who enjoyed my attention and women who wanted access to me. Between those who flirted for validation and those who invested for connection. Men without this skill confuse interest with availability. They mistake warmth for intent. They pour energy into situations that were never meant to deepen. I stopped doing that. Not angrily, efficiently. This efficiency looks like confidence from the outside. From the inside, it feels like conservation. The emotional archaeologist also becomes skilled at detecting tests, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a relational one. Moments where boundaries are probed, where reactions are measured, where composure is quietly evaluated. Before these moments rattled me, I over-explained, I reassured. I tried to smooth things over. Now I let them pass. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood what they were for. Tests reveal stability. Overreaction fails them. By remaining steady, I communicated something without saying it. That my center was not up for negotiation. That I did not need to perform to maintain interest. This steadiness creates attraction because it implies abundance. Not necessarily abundance of options, but abundance of self. A man who is self-contained does not scramble when dynamics shift. He adapts, he observes, he adjusts. Women find this intoxicating because it is rare. Most men respond emotionally to emotional fluctuation. They mirror anxiety. They chase reassurance. They amplify instability. The emotional archaeologist does the opposite. He lowers the volume, and in doing so, he creates depth. depth is not created by intensity. It is created by space, by allowing things to unfold without forcing them into shape. The scar tissue that once protected me now guided me. It filtered noise from signal. It prevented me from investing where alignment didn't exist. It allowed me to remain present without being entangled. This is not emotional unavailability. It is emotional literacy. But it carries a warning. The more skilled you become at reading beneath the surface, the harder it becomes to relax into innocence again. You see too much. You notice patterns others miss. You anticipate endings before they arrive. This awareness is powerful. It is also heavy. Some men use it to control. Others use it to protect. The difference lies in intent. For me, it was protection. I no longer wanted to be surprised by pain I could have predicted. I no longer wanted to confuse intensity with intimacy. I no longer wanted to mistake attention for affection. Emotional archaeology did not make me cynical. It made me exact. And exactness, when paired with restraint, looks indistinguishable from confidence. That is why the wounded man often appears so composed. He is not guessing anymore. He is reading what is actually there. After enough observation, patterns stop feeling theoretical. They become automatic. This is where the romantic refugee develops what I think of as a pattern recognition matrix. Not a checklist, not a set of rules. An internal system that quietly organizes behavior, motivation, and trajectory the moment an interaction begins. I didn't sit down and design it. It formed the same way scar tissue forms. Repeated exposure, repeated correction, repeated consequence. At some point, I no longer needed time to figure out what was happening. I could feel it early. A shift in tone, a mismatch in pacing, a warmth that lacked follow-through. These signals registered before my conscious mind caught up. This is what people mistake for intuition. It isn't instinct, it's compression. The matrix began with recognizing emotional states. I could tell when a woman was newly out of a relationship without being told. Not because of what she said, but because of how she oscillated between intensity and distance. I recognized validation seeking by its hunger for attention without any willingness to invest. I recognized genuine interest by its consistency under low stimulation. Consistency became the marker, not excitement, not chemistry, consistency. Men without this matrix chase sparks. They confuse volatility with passion. They interpret emotional highs as progress, and they're surprised when the connection collapses as quickly as it ignited. I stopped doing that. The matrix taught me to watch cycles, to see how certain interactions follow predictable arcs. Fast intimacy followed by withdrawal, praise followed by boundary testing, interest that grows only when attention is threatened. Once you see these cycles enough times, you stop personalizing them. This alone is a form of power. I no longer wondered what I did wrong when energy shifted. I asked what pattern this belonged to. That question removed emotional noise and replaced it with clarity. The matrix also taught me efficiency. I could assess quickly whether a woman was emotionally available or simply curious, whether she wanted connection or distraction, whether her interest was directed or diffuse. This saved time, emotional time, which is the only resource that actually matters. From the outside, this efficiency looks like confidence, like decisiveness, like certainty. From the inside, it feels like conservation. I wasn't trying to win everyone. I was filtering. The matrix allowed me to calibrate my approach without effort. With some women, I slowed down. With others, I disengaged early. With a few, I allowed myself to lean in slightly more. Not because I was playing roles, because different structures respond to different inputs. This adaptability is often misinterpreted as manipulation. It isn't. It's social intelligence developed through exposure. Just as you wouldn't speak to a grieving person the same way you speak to a colleague, you don't approach every romantic interaction with the same emotional posture. Women responded to this because it felt personal rather than scripted. They felt seen, not handled, understood, not processed. The matrix also included timing. I'd learned that attraction has seasons, that external stress alters availability, that people enter relationships for different reasons at different points in their lives. I stopped forcing alignment where timing made it impossible. This reduced friction. Instead of trying to bend circumstances, I stepped back and let them reveal themselves. That restraint created gravity. Most men exhaust energy trying to overcome obstacles that were never meant to move. The romantic refugee learns to recognize when resistance is information rather than a challenge. This is a subtle but critical shift. The matrix also protected me from self-deception. I could no longer convince myself that mixed signals meant hidden depth, or that inconsistency meant complexity, or that effort would change fundamentals. I saw patterns as they were, and that made walking away easier. Walking away is the most misunderstood behavior in dating. People assume it signals arrogance or emotional detachment. In reality, it signals clarity, the ability to recognize when investment will not compound. The matrix made that decision quiet, unemotional, final. This is where some men mistake the romantic refugee for being emotionally unavailable. What they don't see is that availability has become selective. Not because trust is impossible, but because trust now requires evidence. The matrix also revealed something unsettling. The better I became at recognizing patterns, the harder it became to be surprised. I could anticipate endings early. I could sense misalignment before it declared itself. I could predict when interest would fade before it did. This foresight is useful. It is also numbing. Surprise is part of romance. Innocence is part of desire. And the matrix erodes both. You trade wonder for accuracy. For many men, this trade feels worth it, especially after being hurt repeatedly. But it creates a quiet tension. Because while the matrix protects you from pain, it also distances you from the kind of surrender that made love intoxicating in the first place. I felt this conflict often. I could navigate interactions with ease. I could generate attraction. I could maintain interest without effort. But something was missing. The stakes were lower. The highs were quieter. The outcomes were predictable. This is the success trap no one warns you about. When you become too skilled at reading patterns, you risk living ahead of the moment. You engage with what is likely to happen instead of what is happening. You protect yourself so effectively that nothing fully reaches you. Some men stay here permanently. They enjoy the competence, the control, the absence of devastation. They become admired but rarely known. Others begin to sense the cost. I was one of them. I realized that mastery without vulnerability is hollow, that connection without risk is sterile, that protection taken too far becomes isolation. The matrix is a tool, not a destination. Used wisely, it filters noise and preserves energy. Used defensively, it becomes a wall that no one can cross. The romantic refugee eventually faces a choice: remain protected and unfulfilled, or risk selectively. The men who never make this choice become the emotionally unavailable figures others get hurt by. Not because they are malicious, but because they are closed. The men who do make it begin the final transformation. They learn that not all patterns repeat, that some people are different, that discernment is not the same as avoidance. But without the matrix, that discernment would be impossible. Because you cannot choose vulnerability wisely if you cannot read risk accurately. The pattern recognition matrix is not the end of the journey. It is the gatekeeper. And what you do after passing through it determines whether your transformation leads to connection or permanent distance. The most valuable lesson I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it matters. Pain does not automatically make you wiser. It only gives you the opportunity to become wiser. Some people let pain harden them. Others let it educate them. The difference is not in how deeply they were hurt, but in whether they were willing to look honestly at what the pain was trying to teach. In love, most damage doesn't come from being cruel or careless. It comes from being unconscious, from repeating patterns you never examined, from giving without boundaries, from trusting without discernment, from hoping that intention will protect you from reality. True emotional maturity is not about closing your heart. It's about building a structure strong enough to hold it. A structure where you can feel deeply without losing yourself. Where you can care without collapsing. Where you can be vulnerable without being blind. Scar tissue is stronger than skin, but it's also less sensitive. And the real work of adulthood is deciding when to rely on that strength and when to soften again. Protection keeps you safe. Selective openness keeps you alive. The goal is not to avoid being hurt. That's impossible. The goal is to be hurt in ways that teach you instead of destroy you. To choose growth over bitterness. Awareness over fantasy. Depth over performance. If any part of this story reflected something you've lived through, I'd like to hear it. Leave a comment and share what you recognized or what this made you think about. And if you value calm, honest explorations of psychology, relationships, and personal growth, consider subscribing to the channel. Not out of obligation. Only if this kind of reflection adds something real to your life.